Have you ever been in a crowded room where conversations flow around you like water around a stone, never quite touching? Or experienced that strange sensation of speaking in a group, only to watch people's eyes pass over you as if you'd said nothing at all? This isn't just shyness. This isn't just social anxiety. This is the profound experience of feeling invisible, of existing in a space where your presence seems to register with almost no one, and your thoughts, feelings, and very existence feel like they occupy no real weight in the world. Invisibility, in the psychological sense, is far more than a metaphor. It's a deeply felt, neurologically measurable state where individuals experience a chronic sense of being overlooked, underestimated, and fundamentally unseen by others. For millions of people around the world, this isn't a fleeting moment of self-consciousness. It's a persistent backdrop to their entire lives, a quiet hum of disconnection that colors every interaction, every relationship, and every moment of self-perception. The experience of invisibility exists on a spectrum. At one end, there are people who occasionally feel overlooked in certain social situations. They might have a conversation where they struggle to contribute, or find themselves in family dynamics where their opinions don't seem to matter. But for many others, invisibility is far more pervasive. These individuals have spent years, sometimes entire lifetimes, operating under the assumption that they don't truly matter, that their needs are secondary, that their voice has no real power. This psychological invisibility can lead to profound consequences: untreated depression, anxiety disorders, dissociation, and a fragmented sense of self that makes it nearly impossible to build healthy relationships or pursue meaningful goals. What makes invisibility particularly insidious is that it often operates in silence. Unlike trauma that announces itself through dramatic symptoms or grief that has its own recognized timeline, invisibility wears the mask of normalcy. People who feel invisible often appear fine on the outside. They might be high achievers, people pleasers, or quiet observers who seem content. But beneath that surface, there exists a fundamental disconnection from their own worth and an internalized belief that they simply don't count the way other people do. Research in developmental psychology and attachment theory has begun to illuminate the roots of this phenomenon. When children grow up in environments where their emotional needs go unrecognized or unmet, where they're not seen, heard, or validated for who they are, something critical happens in their developing brains. Neural pathways form around the assumption that their inner world doesn't matter. Their sense of self begins to form in shadow, as if they're a background character in a story being written by everyone else. The statistics on emotional neglect and invisible making dynamics are sobering. Studies suggest that somewhere between 30 and 40% of children experience some form of emotional neglect, a category that includes the absence of emotional validation, acknowledgement, and attunement. Many of these children grow into adults who carry an almost unshakable conviction that they're fundamentally not worth paying attention to. They've learned, through countless micro-rejections and silences, that their existence is optional in the lives of others. But invisibility isn't just about childhood wounds. Modern life seems uniquely designed to manufacture this feeling. We live in an age of unprecedented connection, Yet, paradoxically, many people report feeling more isolated than ever. Social media shows us curated versions of everyone else's significance while we struggle to find evidence of our own. Workplaces reduce people to their productivity metrics. Families operate on patterns of communication where some voices are amplified and others are effectively silenced. The modern person who feels invisible isn't struggling against medieval neglect. They're drowning in a sea of connection that somehow never quite reaches them. Understanding the psychology of invisibility matters profoundly because it's the first step toward healing. When someone realizes that their feeling of invisibility isn't a character flaw or an accurate reflection of their worth, but rather a symptom of a particular psychological pattern, one that was often installed during vulnerable developmental periods, something shifts. They begin to recognize that invisibility isn't their identity. It's a strategy, an adaptation, a learned way of being that made sense at one point in their life. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. Throughout this exploration, we'll journey through the psychological architecture of invisibility. We'll examine how it begins, how it persists, how it shapes everything from our nervous systems to our closest relationships. We'll look at the research that explains why invisible people often seem invisible to themselves, why they struggle to advocate for their own needs, and why recognition from others, when it finally comes, can feel almost dangerous. Most importantly, we'll explore pathways toward visibility, toward building a sense of self that isn't dependent on how much attention others pay, and toward creating the internal validation that was perhaps missing so long ago. The people who feel invisible are not broken. They're not defective. They're responding exactly the way human nervous systems are designed to respond to neglect, abandonment, and the absence of affirming presence. They're survivors of a particular kind of harm, one that doesn't leave bruises, but echoes through every aspect of their psychological experience. And their stories deserve to be heard, understood, and honored. Because feeling invisible in a world that desperately needs your unique contribution is one of the quiet tragedies of human experience. When psychologists and neuroscientists talk about invisibility in the emotional and relational sense, they're describing a specific psychological state that encompasses several interconnected experiences. It's not merely about being physically unnoticed, though that can be part of it. Rather, it's about a pervasive lack of emotional recognition, a sense that one's inner world, needs, and essential self are not being received or acknowledged by the people in one's life. The experience of invisibility involves what researchers call relational absence. This means that even in the presence of other people, there exists a profound sense of separation and non-recognition. Someone might sit at a family dinner table, surrounded by relatives, and yet feel as though they exist in a different dimension, as if an invisible barrier separates them from genuine connection. Their words may be heard on an auditory level, but they're not truly received. Their emotions are not met with empathy. Their needs are not anticipated or addressed. In the language of attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, this represents a failure of attunement, the inability of caregivers to sense, interpret, and respond to a child's emotional signals. What makes psychological invisibility distinct from shyness or introversion is that it's fundamentally about how others respond to you, or rather, how they fail to respond. An introvert might prefer solitude and feel drained by excessive social interaction, but they typically maintain a strong internal sense of self. A shy person might struggle with social anxiety, but can usually access feelings of worth and value. Someone who feels invisible, by contrast, has internalized the external experience of non-recognition into their very core sense of being. They've come to believe that there's something about them that inherently fails to register as important or worthy of attention. Neurologically, this pattern involves several brain systems. The anterior insula, which processes self-awareness and interoception, our ability to sense our internal states, often shows different activation patterns in people who've experienced chronic invisibility. The default mode network, which activates when we think about ourselves and others, can become dysregulated in ways that make it difficult to access a coherent sense of self. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, our executive function center, often struggles because there's no secure internal sense of self to regulate and maintain. The neurotransmitter systems involved in feeling seen and valued are also affected. When we're recognized and appreciated by others, our brains release dopamine and activate the reward centers that reinforce social bonding and self-worth. For people who grow up largely invisible, these reward circuits form around the opposite experience. They become conditioned to expect non-recognition. Over time, a paradoxical pattern can emerge where genuine attention feels uncomfortable or even threatening because it doesn't match the neural architecture that's been built through years of invisibility. Invisibility also involves what psychologists call identity foreclosure, a term from Erikson's developmental theory. This occurs when a person's sense of identity fails to develop fully because there's been no external validation or mirroring to help shape and reinforce who they are. Instead of a robust, differentiated self that's been reflected back to them through others' eyes, invisible people often develop what might be called a hollow self, an identity that's largely defined by the absence of definition, by what they're not rather than what they are. The manifestations of invisibility are remarkably varied, yet they share common threads. Some invisible people become high achievers, attempting to finally matter by being exceptional at something, anything, that might finally warrant attention. Others become people pleasers, learning to be so attuned to everyone else's needs that they effectively disappear into service. Still others withdraw, their invisibility becoming self-imposed as a defense mechanism. If they're not noticed anyway, they might as well opt out of the painful game of seeking recognition. Some invisible people become almost aggressively self-sufficient, learning that they cannot rely on others to see them or support them, so they must handle everything alone. And many cycle through various combinations of these patterns depending on context and circumstance. One crucial aspect of psychological invisibility is that it creates a particular relationship with shame. Unlike shame that comes from doing something wrong, the shame of invisibility is existential. It's the shame of being, of existing, in a form that apparently doesn't matter. This generates what Brené Brown calls shame-based perfectionism, a relentless drive to be perfect, to achieve more, to do better. in the desperate hope that finally, someone will see them and recognize their worth. Another key element is what researchers identify as chronic loneliness in connection. This is the paradoxical state where someone can be surrounded by people, in relationships, in families, in workplaces, and still feel profoundly alone. The loneliness isn't about the absence of people. It's about the absence of felt connection, of being truly known, of existing as a realized presence rather than a vague background figure. This particular type of loneliness can actually be more painful than the loneliness of social isolation, because it carries the additional weight of rejection and unworthiness embedded within it. The psychological invisibility also deeply affects how invisible people interpret the world and their place in it. They tend to adopt what psychologists call a minimizing cognitive schema, a characteristic way of thinking where they automatically downsize their own experiences, needs, and feelings. When something good happens to them, they might think, well, that was probably just luck, or they were doing someone else a favor. When they experience a loss or a difficulty, they're likely to minimize it rather than honor it as legitimate pain. This habitual minimization extends to how they talk about themselves, often prefacing their contributions with qualifiers like, "I'm probably wrong, but," or "this might be stupid, but," or "I don't know anything about this, but." It's also important to understand that invisibility exists in relationship to visibility. We are visible when our inner world is being received and reflected back to us by others. We are invisible when that reception is absent or inconsistent. This means that invisibility is not simply an internal state, it's a relational one. It's created in the space between ourselves and others, in the gaps between our attempts to be known and others' capacity or willingness to know us. This is why, paradoxically, invisible people often feel more invisible in close relationships than among strangers. Strangers have no particular obligation to see us, but the people we love do. And when they fail to do so, the invisibility cuts deeper. Understanding these psychological dimensions of invisibility is crucial because it reframes the experience as something real, measurable, and grounded in how human brains, nervous systems, and relational patterns actually work. Invisibility isn't weakness. It's not a failure of character. It's not something that invisible people are doing wrong. Rather, it's a psychological adaptation to specific relational and developmental circumstances, one that made perfect sense at the time it was formed and continues to operate according to its own logic, even when it no longer serves the person experiencing it. The origins of psychological invisibility almost always trace back to childhood. While invisibility can certainly be triggered or exacerbated by adult experiences, the deepest roots of feeling unseen almost always germinate in the earliest relationships, particularly with primary caregivers. Understanding this developmental trajectory is essential to making sense of why some adults carry such a pervasive sense of not mattering. Attachment theory provides the foundational framework for understanding how invisibility begins. John Bowlby's work demonstrated that infants are born with innate needs for connection, attunement, and responsiveness from their caregivers. When a baby cries, they're not being manipulative or demanding. They're engaging in an ancient biological dance of communication. The caregiver receives the signal, interprets it, and responds appropriately. This back and forth creates what Bowlby called a secure attachment, a fundamental sense that the world is responsive to their needs and that they matter enough to be responded to. But not all children receive this responsive attunement. Some are born into environments where caregivers are emotionally unavailable, preoccupied, overwhelmed, or simply unaware of the importance of emotional responsiveness. When a child cries and nobody comes, when a child shares excitement and is met with indifference, when a child expresses fear and their caregiver dismisses or minimizes it, something crucial fails to form. The neural pathways that would have encoded the message, "My needs matter," and "I am worthy of response," don't develop as they should. Instead, alternative pathways begin to form. My needs are inconvenient. I shouldn't bother people. There's something wrong with wanting to be seen and heard. Psychologist Janice Webb's research on emotional neglect identifies what she calls running on empty, a state where children grow up in families that seem, on the surface, perfectly functional. The parents aren't abusive, the house isn't chaotic, the bills are paid. But somewhere in the architecture of the family system, emotional attunement and validation are simply absent. Children in these environments learn that their inner worlds, their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences are not topics of family conversation or concern. They learn to ignore their own emotional signals because those signals are never met with empathy or understanding. One particular pattern that breeds invisibility is what psychologists call parentification. This occurs when children are forced to take on emotional or even practical responsibilities that should belong to the adults in their lives. A child might become the emotional support for a struggling parent, learning to read and manage their parents' moods rather than being nurtured themselves. They become invisible as children. Their own developmental needs disappear, and visible only insofar as they're useful to the parent's emotional regulation. These children often become hyper-attuned to everyone else's emotions while remaining bewilderingly disconnected from their own. Another common pathway to childhood invisibility is being part of a family system where one or more siblings receive disproportionate attention. This might be the high achiever who gets all the praise, the struggling sibling who requires extra support, or the favored child for any number of reasons. Meanwhile, other children in the family occupy a kind of middle space where they're neither exceptional nor problematic enough to warrant focused attention. They're not neglected in the dramatic sense of going without food or care, but they are invisible in the sense of being psychologically unencountered. Cultural and socioeconomic factors also play a role. Children raised in poverty, immigrant families navigating new cultures, or families where parents are working multiple jobs to survive may experience invisibility, not because their parents don't love them, but because basic survival demands have consumed all available mental and emotional bandwidth. A child whose parent is working 2 jobs, then coming home exhausted, may understand intellectually that their parent loves them, but emotionally they've still received the message that their needs cannot be prioritized. The invisibility isn't about rejection, it's about structural impossibility. Gender dynamics frequently intersect with invisibility as well. Across many cultures and family systems, certain emotional expressions are welcomed while others are pathologized or ignored. A child whose temperament or identity doesn't match their family's expectations may become invisible not through active rejection, but through a subtle process of non-recognition. The family can't see who the child actually is because they're too busy seeing who they expected the child to be. During childhood, when invisibility is being installed, the child's developing brain is making crucial attributions about the world and their place in it. The pre-operational child, roughly ages 2 to 7, engages in what Piaget called egocentrism. They tend to interpret events as being about them. So when a parent is emotionally unavailable, the child doesn't think, "My parent is stressed about finances." They think, "There's something about me that makes it hard for my parent to pay attention to me." When emotional needs go unmet, children don't conclude, "My family doesn't know how to attune emotionally." They conclude, "I am not the kind of person worth attuning to." These childhood conclusions, formed in the developing brain during its most neuroplastic period, become scaffolding upon which the entire self is constructed. As the child develops through latency, ages 7 to 12, these foundational beliefs are reinforced through every interaction. A child who's learned they're invisible becomes more invisible. They speak less, they claim less space, they don't draw attention to themselves, and because they're less visible, they receive less attention, which further confirms the original conclusion. A self-fulfilling cycle has been established. Adolescence, that crucial period of identity formation, can either interrupt this pattern or cement it. Some teenagers, fed up with invisibility, rebel into visibility, becoming louder, more provocative, more insistent on being seen. But many continue the pattern, their invisibility now compounded by the typical adolescent experience of awkwardness and self-consciousness. The invisible teen might spend their high school years watching others form tight friendships and romantic connections, unable to quite manage the same level of social boldness. Or they might achieve academically or athletically, their worth seemingly contingent on external accomplishment rather than inherent existence. By the time invisible children reach adulthood, they've typically spent 15 to 20 years, or more, being shaped by a fundamental message: you don't really matter. This isn't a conscious belief they could easily articulate and dismiss. It's encoded in their nervous system, woven into the very architecture of their self-concept, reflected in their automatic thoughts and behavioral patterns. And now, as adults navigating relationships, workplaces, and social situations, they carry this invisible architecture with them. Emotional neglect is a specific type of maltreatment that doesn't involve active harm, but rather the absence of emotional attunement, validation, and connection. Unlike physical abuse, which leaves visible marks, or sexual abuse, which has distinct traumatic signatures, emotional neglect operates through absence, through the gaps between a child's needs and the responsiveness they receive. This makes it particularly difficult to recognize and name, even for the people who experienced it. The research on emotional neglect, particularly the work of Jonas Webb and John Running, reveals that children who experience chronic emotional neglect often develop in ways that look, on the surface, quite functional. They may be high achievers, responsible, self-sufficient. They often have difficulty identifying what they felt, explaining that they don't really remember feeling much of anything during childhood. This phenomenon reflects a neurological adaptation. When emotional experiences consistently go unmirrored and unvalidated, the developing brain essentially turns down the volume on emotional signaling. The child learns to suppress their own emotional awareness because those signals are getting no response anyway. The ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Research conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, identified emotional neglect as one of the significant adverse experiences that predicts both physical and mental health outcomes in adulthood. While much of the attention around ACEs has focused on active traumas like abuse and violence, emotional neglect emerges as a crucial factor in predicting depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and relationship difficulties. Individuals who experienced emotional neglect in childhood show higher rates of chronic illness, obesity, and suicide attempts throughout their lives compared to general populations. One of the most significant impacts of emotional neglect is what might be called emotional illiteracy, a difficulty identifying, naming, and understanding one's own emotional states. Children who grow up in environments where emotions are ignored, minimized, or ridiculed don't develop the language or the neural pathways for processing emotional information. They might reach adulthood unable to distinguish between sadness and anxiety, or entirely confused about what anger actually feels like. Some emotionally neglected people report that they didn't even realize they could feel emotions until much later in life. They'd been going through life somewhat numb, interpreting this numbness as normal. This emotional disconnection directly feeds into invisibility. When you can't feel your own emotions, you become invisible to yourself. You can't advocate for your needs because you don't know what you need. You can't express yourself authentically because you don't have clear access to your internal experience. You become increasingly dependent on external cues to determine how you should feel or what matters. If others seem to care about something, it must matter. If others don't seem bothered by something, perhaps you shouldn't be either. Your emotional compass becomes demagnetized, always pointing toward what everyone else is indicating, rather than toward your own internal truth. Emotionally neglected children also commonly develop hypervigilance toward others' emotional states, a kind of emotional scanning system that's constantly monitoring the moods of people around them. This makes sense as an adaptation. If your own emotional needs aren't being met, you learn to become an expert at reading everyone else's needs in hopes of finding some way to belong or be valued. This hypervigilance can persist into adulthood as a relentless focus on other people's emotions, needs, and reactions, while one's own internal state remains fuzzy and inaccessible. Another crucial impact of emotional neglect is the development of profound self-doubt and imposter syndrome. Because emotionally neglected children never had their accomplishments reflected back to them by an emotionally attuned adult, they struggle to internalize their own successes. They might get a good grade, but because nobody validates the effort and growth it represents, they attribute it to luck or the teacher being easy. They might receive a compliment, but instead of taking it in, they immediately dismiss it or search for evidence that the person is mistaken. Over time, this becomes a pattern where nothing positive they accomplish can stick to their sense of self. They carry around an internal scorecard that always reads, "I'm not actually that smart, capable, or worthy." The relationship difficulties stemming from emotional neglect are particularly profound. Many emotionally neglected children grow into adults who struggle with what psychologists call earned secure attachment. The ability to form stable, reciprocal relationships where both people's needs matter. They often find themselves in relationships where they give far more than they receive, or where they remain emotionally distant and unable to be fully vulnerable. Some swing between these extremes, unable to find a middle ground of healthy interdependence. Research also shows that emotionally neglected individuals often struggle with what's called affect regulation, the ability to manage and modulate emotional responses. Because they never learned to do this through healthy modeling and guidance during childhood, they often find emotions overwhelming when they do emerge. They might experience what feels like a sudden eruption of rage or sadness, seemingly out of proportion to the trigger, because they've been suppressing emotions for so long. Or they might find that emotions simply don't emerge at all, leaving them in a state of chronic flatness or numbness. One particularly insidious impact of emotional neglect is the way it teaches people not to trust their own perception of reality. A child who expresses concern and is told, "You're being too sensitive," learns to question their own reality testing. A child who remembers an event one way, but is corrected by a parent who remembers it differently, learns that their own memories might be unreliable. Over time, this breeds a kind of self-doubt that extends to every domain of life, not just emotions, but also perception, judgment, and reasoning. Invisible adults often describe feeling like they're always second-guessing themselves, never quite sure if their interpretation of situations is accurate. The impact of emotional neglect on self-concept is also measurable in how invisible people talk about themselves. They often use what linguists call hedging language, qualifiers and softeners that minimize their own statements. "I might be wrong, but probably nobody cares, but this is probably obvious, but." This linguistic pattern reflects the internal belief system installed during emotional neglect. Your thoughts and feelings probably don't matter, so before you express them, you should apologize for their existence. One particularly important finding from research on emotional neglect is that its effects can be equally powerful, whether it occurred in a context of poverty and struggle or in a context of material abundance. In fact, some research suggests that emotional neglect in middle-class and affluent families can be particularly confusing for children because there's no clear external explanation for why their emotional needs aren't being met. They have everything they materially need, which makes them feel like they shouldn't be struggling, which then adds shame and confusion on top of the original neglect. The lasting impact of emotional neglect on invisibility, then, is multifaceted. It creates a person who is invisible to themselves, who doesn't trust their own perception, who struggles to identify their needs, who attributes success to external factors rather than internal capability, and who has learned through thousands of interactions that their inner world simply doesn't matter. This foundation of invisibility, laid down during the vulnerable developmental period of childhood, becomes extraordinarily difficult to shift without intentional, sustained effort toward healing and integration. At the deepest level, invisibility isn't primarily about being overlooked by others, though that's often how it manifests. It's about a loss of connection to your own self. This phenomenon is what psychologists call identity erasure, and it represents one of the most profound psychological consequences of chronic invisibility. Identity development, according to Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, is a key task of adolescence. During this period, teenagers are supposed to explore various roles, ideologies, and relationships to develop a coherent sense of who they are. But this identity development doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens through a process of being seen, received, and reflected by others. Parents, teachers, peers, and mentors all serve as mirrors that help the adolescent understand who they are. When someone says, "You're really creative," or "You've got a great sense of humor," or "You're someone who cares about people," they're providing crucial information that helps the adolescent integrate these observations into their emerging identity. For invisible people, this mirroring process is largely absent. The invisible teenager goes through adolescence without receiving clear, affirming reflections of who they are. So instead of developing a robust, integrated sense of self, they develop what might be described as a hollow self, an identity that's largely defined by absence. They might describe themselves primarily through negation. I'm not outgoing like my sister. I'm not smart like my brother. I'm not athletic like my cousin. They define themselves by what they're not, rather than by what they are. This identity erosion often creates what psychologists call false self-functioning. Developed theory by psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott, the concept of true self versus false self describes how people who haven't received adequate emotional attunement learn to present a version of themselves to the world that doesn't necessarily correspond to who they actually are. The invisible person develops an especially sophisticated false self, someone who's learned to read the room exquisitely well and then become exactly who the room seems to need them to be. In one context, they might be quiet and accommodating. In another, they might be competent and professional. In another, they might be the funny one or the thoughtful listener. But underneath all these personas, there's often a confused uncertainty. Who am I actually when nobody's looking? This fragmentation of identity can reach a point where invisible people lose track of their own preferences, desires, and values. Ask an invisible person what they want for dinner, and they might literally not know how to answer. Their immediate instinct is to figure out what everyone else wants so they can choose accordingly. Ask them what they're passionate about, and they might draw a blank because they've never had the space or validation to explore their own interests and develop genuine passions. They've become so practiced at disappearing that they've essentially erased themselves. In some cases, this identity erasure can progress into what's called dissociation, a psychological state where individuals feel disconnected from their own body, thoughts, or feelings. Some invisible people describe feeling like they're watching their life from outside their body, observing themselves going through the motions, but not really inhabiting their own experience. This isn't psychosis. They still know intellectually what's real, but there's a felt sense of disconnection and unreality. This extreme form of identitas erasure is the nervous system's way of coping when invisibility has become so total that the self itself needs to disappear to survive. The invisibility feeds into identity erasure through several mechanisms. First, there's the direct mechanism. If nobody sees you, you can't develop a sense of self that's grounded in being perceived by others. Second, there's the indirect mechanism. If you're not seen, you don't receive the feedback and validation necessary to refine and integrate your emerging identity. And third, there's the defensive mechanism. If being visible historically led to being disappointed, neglected, or rejected, the best defense is to make yourself truly invisible, to erase the self from public view entirely. This self-erasure often shows up as what psychologists call self-diminishment, a habitual pattern of making oneself smaller, quieter, less present. The invisible person learns to take up less space, literally and figuratively. They might sit in the back of the room, avoid eye contact, keep their voice low, and generally try to minimize their presence. Over time, this becomes so automatic that they lose awareness they're doing it. They're not consciously choosing to disappear. Their nervous system has learned that disappearance equals safety. One of the most painful aspects of identity erasure is what it does to the invisible person's ability to imagine a future. Identity development and future orientation are closely linked. When you have a coherent sense of self, you can imagine yourself as an adult, pursuing goals that align with your values and talents. But when your identity is fragmented or erased, the future becomes murky. Invisible people often struggle to imagine who they might become because they don't have a clear sense of who they are now. This can lead to what psychologists call foreclosure in career and life planning, where people simply settle into whatever role seems convenient, rather than choosing a path that aligns with their authentic selves. The relationship between identity erasure and invisibility is bidirectional. Invisibility causes identity erasure, but identity erasure also perpetuates invisibility. When you don't have a strong sense of self, you don't have anything to express. You don't have opinions that feel worth voicing, passions that feel worth pursuing, or values that feel worth defending. You become even more invisible because there's literally less of you to be seen. This can create a downward spiral where invisibility leads to self-erasure, which leads to even greater invisibility, which leads to further self-erosion. Healing from this requires what might be called identity reconstruction, a process of reconnecting with the authentic self that exists underneath the false self, the defenses, and the erasure. This isn't about creating a new identity from scratch, but rather about removing the layers of invisibility that have buried the self and allowing the authentic self underneath to re-emerge and be known. This is challenging work because it requires someone to become visible in contexts where they've spent years learning to disappear and to claim a self that's been denied existence for so long. Perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of psychological invisibility is that it produces a unique kind of loneliness, one that can feel even more acute in the presence of other people. This is the loneliness of not being known, even by those closest to you. It's the loneliness of existing in a crowd and feeling utterly alone. It's the loneliness of having people in your life who would describe themselves as close to you, yet feeling fundamentally unseen by all of them. This phenomenon, which researchers call relational loneliness or subjective social isolation, is remarkably common in invisible people. They might have friends, but the friendships don't include their authentic self. They might be in romantic relationships, but their partner doesn't truly see them. They might be active in their community or workplace, yet feel disconnected from everyone around them. The presence of other people, paradoxically, can intensify the feeling of invisibility rather than alleviating it, because the non-recognition becomes even more poignant in contexts where connection should be possible. Research on loneliness distinguishes between social loneliness, which occurs when someone is genuinely isolated and lacks adequate social connections, and emotional loneliness, which occurs when someone has social connections but lacks deep, meaningful bonds. Invisible people often experience emotional loneliness despite having rich social networks. They might attend parties, have work colleagues they eat lunch with, or be part of group activities, yet experience a profound sense of disconnection from all of it. One reason for this particular type of loneliness relates to what psychologists call authentic relating. When we connect authentically with another person, we share some version of our true self and receive recognition for it. But invisible people often lack access to their true self, having spent years hidden behind the false self-adaptations they've developed. So even in contexts where connection is theoretically possible, they can't quite achieve it because they're not bringing their authentic self to the interaction. Additionally, invisible people often operate with what might be called preemptive distance. They've learned through experience that being seen might lead to disappointment, rejection, or misuse. So even when they're with people who might actually be capable of genuinely seeing and receiving them, they maintain a subtle barrier of distance. They don't quite trust that the other person's interest is real or sustained. They don't reveal the parts of themselves that feel most vulnerable. They keep their interior world carefully guarded. The result is that they're never truly emotionally available, even when they're physically present. Invisible people also frequently engage in what researchers call surface-level sharing. They might tell people facts about their lives, what they did last weekend, what movie they watched, what happened at work. But they don't share the emotional content underneath those facts. They don't talk about how they felt, what it meant to them, or what they struggled with. Neuroscientist and researcher Brené Brown has identified this as part of shame-based relating. When we're ashamed of ourselves, we share information but not intimacy, details but not depth. And this surface-level sharing, while it might appear as connection from the outside, leaves both parties feeling the absence of real contact. The loneliness of invisibility is also intensified by what psychologists call self-fulfilling prophecy. Because invisible people expect to be unseen and unheard, they communicate in ways that actually make it harder for others to see and hear them. They might mumble slightly, or speak with minimal inflection, or avoid eye contact. They might give up quickly when their comment isn't immediately picked up in conversation. They don't persist in sharing about themselves the way more visible people do. So others, responding to these cues, naturally pay less attention. The invisibility that started as something done to the person becomes something they've internalized and begun doing to themselves. There's also a particularly painful dynamic that often emerges in long-term relationships involving invisible people. As time goes on, partners, family members, and close friends often develop ideas about who the invisible person is based on their patterns of behavior and communication. But these ideas are often projections. They're based on the false self and the adaptations, not on the authentic person underneath. So the invisible person finds themselves known, but not really known. The people closest to them have developed an image of them that's partially or entirely inaccurate. And because the invisible person has become practiced at going along with whatever identity others project onto them, they often don't correct these misperceptions. So the person who should know them best often understands them least accurately. This loneliness takes a particular toll psychologically. Psychologist John Cacioppo's research on loneliness identified that subjective loneliness, feeling lonely regardless of whether you're objectively isolated, produces measurable changes in stress hormones, immune function, and brain activity. People who experience chronic emotional loneliness show increased cortisol, dysregulated autonomic nervous systems, and higher rates of depression and anxiety. For invisible people who might have extensive social networks that nonetheless provide no sense of connection, this chronic emotional loneliness can accumulate over years or decades. It's important to note that invisible people aren't always aware of how disconnected they are. Some have become so practiced at functioning despite the loneliness that they've normalized it. They might intellectually understand that relationships are supposed to feel close, but they don't realize that their own relationships don't match that description. They might assume that everyone feels somewhat invisible and disconnected, not recognizing that their experience is different from that of people with secure attachments and history of being emotionally recognized. The pandemic particularly highlighted this dynamic. Many invisible people found that remote work and reduced social interaction didn't substantially increase their loneliness because they weren't experiencing connection anyway. Meanwhile, naturally, social people who suddenly lost their daily interactions felt keenly the deprivation. This suggested that for invisible people, the problem isn't primarily about frequency of contact. It's about the quality of attunement and recognition within contact. You could increase interaction with an invisible person by tenfold, but if nobody's actually seeing them, the loneliness will persist. One somewhat counterintuitive finding from research on invisible people and loneliness is that some of them seem to adapt remarkably well to solitude. They develop rich inner lives, pursue individual interests, and don't necessarily feel desperate need for social connection the way socially oriented people do. This can appear on the surface like they've transcended the pain of invisibility by choosing solitude over inadequate connection. But this adaptation often masks an undercurrent of sadness, a kind of resigned acceptance that authentic connection simply isn't available to them, so they've made peace with their own company. It's not that they don't want connection, it's that they've stopped expecting it. The loneliness of invisibility is perhaps one of the clearest indicators of how deeply the wound goes. Because loneliness is an emotional signal, your brain's way of telling you the connection has been disrupted and needs to be restored. For invisible people, this loneliness signal often goes on for years or decades without being adequately responded to, because nobody around them recognizes how disconnected they actually feel. They continue to function, continue to show up, continue to be present, but underneath there's this quiet, chronic ache of not being truly known or truly chosen. When invisible people look in the mirror, and we're speaking here metaphorically as well as literally, what they see is profoundly distorted by the developmental history that created their invisibility. Their self-perception is filtered through layers of internalized beliefs about their worthlessness, their unimportance, and their fundamental unfitness to be noticed or valued. Understanding how invisible people see themselves is crucial because this self-perception drives nearly every decision they make and shapes every relationship they enter. The cognitive science behind self-perception reveals that we don't actually see ourselves objectively. Instead, our self-concept is constructed through a process of integrating feedback we've received from others, attributions we make about our own behavior, and deeply held beliefs about what kind of person we are. For people with secure attachment histories and consistent validation, this self-concept tends to be relatively stable and positively balanced. They see themselves as generally competent, worthy, and acceptable. For invisible people, however, this self-concept construction has proceeded from a very different foundation. Research on self-esteem and self-worth in psychologically invisible people reveals a particular pattern. They often have adequate or even high self-esteem in narrow domains while maintaining low global self-worth. An invisible person might see themselves as competent at their job, skilled at caregiving, or capable in specific technical domains. But despite this specific competence, they maintain an underlying belief that they're not fundamentally valuable as a person. They can acknowledge achievements without being able to feel genuine pride in them. They can receive recognition without being able to truly accept it. This pattern reflects what psychologists call contingent self-esteem, self-worth that's entirely dependent on external validation and accomplishment. Unlike more securely attached people whose self-worth has some grounding in simply existing and being valued, invisible people's self-esteem rises and falls based on whether they've managed to be impressive enough, useful enough, or invisible enough to avoid negative attention. This creates a kind of psychological treadmill where they're constantly working to maintain their worth through external achievement because their internal sense of value is fundamentally shaky. Invisible people's self-perception is also characterized by what psychologists call self-discounting, a habitual pattern of minimizing or dismissing positive information about themselves while magnifying negative information. When something good happens, the internal narrative is quick to find external explanation. That was just luck, or they felt obligated, or I didn't really deserve it. When something goes wrong, by contrast, the internal narrative is equally quick to find internal explanation. I messed it up. I'm incompetent. I always make mistakes. This pattern is so automatic that invisible people often aren't aware they're doing it. They believe they're simply being realistic, when actually they're operating from a systematically biased perception system. The phenomenon of imposter syndrome is nearly ubiquitous among invisible people. Despite external evidence of competence, degrees earned, Jobs secured, projects completed, invisible people often feel like frauds. They attribute their accomplishments to luck, timing, or the lowered standards of others. They live in anticipation of being exposed as the incompetent, worthless person they believe themselves to be. This isn't mere modesty or humility. It's a distorted perception system that's systematically incapable of receiving positive information about the self. Body image perception in invisible people also often reveals deep distortion. Some invisible people become disconnected from their bodies entirely. They might describe not being aware of their body most of the time, or not having strong feelings about how they look. Others fixate on their appearance as the problem, believing that if they could just look different, thinner, prettier, more put together, then they would finally be visible and valuable. The body, having been largely unseen and unattended to, becomes either invisible to consciousness or becomes a repository for shame and self-directed criticism. Invisible people's perception of how others see them is also frequently distorted. They tend to assume negative regard from others, even when evidence contradicts this. A teacher who doesn't call on them immediately must think they're stupid. A friend who doesn't respond to a text immediately must be losing interest. A family member who doesn't ask about their day must not care about what they're up to. This systematic interpretation of ambiguous social information in the most negative possible direction contributes to a self-fulfilling cycle. Believing others don't value them leads to more withdrawn behavior, which leads to less interaction, which confirms the original belief. One particularly important aspect of how invisible people see themselves is their explanation for why they're invisible. Many develop what might be called deficit narratives, internal stories where their invisibility is because there's something wrong with them. Some believe they're simply not interesting enough. Others believe they lack the social skills to be visible. Still others believe they're fundamentally broken or unlovable in some way. What's notable is that these explanations, while often believed absolutely by the invisible person, don't always match external reality. An invisible person might insist they have nothing interesting to say, while those close to them would disagree. They might claim to have terrible social skills while behaving appropriately in most contexts. This gap between how invisible people perceive themselves and how they're actually perceived by others creates a kind of chronic internal dissonance. On some level, they notice that people don't treat them as badly as they believe they deserve to be treated. They receive compliments, they're included in activities, people seem to actually like spending time with them. But this contradictory evidence isn't strong enough to override the deep internal belief system that says they're not fundamentally valuable. So they live with this contradiction, gradually dismissing the positive evidence and clinging to the conviction that they're ultimately not worth seeing. The self-perception of invisible people often includes what's called narrative discontinuity, an inability to construct a coherent story of their own life. They might be able to recount events, but the emotional through line is missing. They can't articulate a clear sense of who they've been, who they are, or who they're becoming. Their life story feels fragmented, as if they're observing someone else's biography rather than living their own. This narrative discontinuity mirrors the identity erasure discussed earlier. Without a coherent sense of self, it's difficult to construct a coherent life narrative. Perhaps most painfully, invisible people often see themselves through what might be called a lens of unworthiness. This lens colors every perception. If they're not worth seeing, then they're probably not worth much of anything. If people don't seek out their company, they must not be good company. If they struggle with something, it's because they're fundamentally incapable, rather than because they, like everyone, sometimes find things difficult. This lens is so pervasive and so fundamental to how they process reality that it often feels like objective truth rather than distorted perception. But it is, in fact, a learned pattern of self-interpretation that can be gradually changed through consistent positive experience and cognitive work. While invisibility is primarily a psychological and relational phenomenon, it doesn't exist only in the mind. It has profound effects on the body, on the nervous system, on immune function, on how we experience physical sensation and pain. This principle, illustrated beautifully in Bessel van der Kolk's work on trauma and the body, applies equally to psychological invisibility. The body keeps score of being unseen. When children experience chronic emotional neglect and invisibility, their developing nervous systems are shaped by an environment of inconsistent attunement and insufficient responsiveness. The nervous system develops within a relational context, and when that context is characterized by disconnection, the resulting nervous system is dysregulated. Its ability to shift between states of activation and calm, between sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic rest, becomes compromised. This dysregulation can persist throughout the lifespan, shaping how invisible people experience and respond to stress. One manifestation of nervous system dysregulation in invisible people is hypervigilance, a state of chronic activation where the nervous system remains in a kind of heightened alert. This makes sense as an adaptation to invisibility. If you're not securely attached to your environment and can't rely on caregivers to notice threats, your nervous system learns to remain constantly scanning for danger. As an adult, this hypervigilance persists even in safe environments. The invisible person remains slightly tense, slightly on edge, perpetually monitoring their environment and other people's moods. This chronic activation takes a physical toll, contributing to muscle tension, headaches, and overall exhaustion. Conversely, some invisible people develop a different nervous system pattern: freeze. They've learned to respond to the absence of attunement by shutting down, by making themselves small and still, as if reduced activation will finally make them safe. These individuals often move through life in a kind of low activation state. They report feeling tired even after adequate sleep. They struggle with motivation and initiative. They move slowly and speak quietly, as if conserving energy or trying not to draw attention. This freeze response, while effective as an adaptation to chronic neglect, leads to its own set of problems: reduced engagement with life, difficulty mobilizing for goals, and a sense of existing in a kind of slow-motion reality. The stress hormone system is particularly affected by chronic invisibility. Research on attachment and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which is the body's central stress response system, shows that children with insecure attachments develop dysregulated cortisol patterns. They might have chronically elevated cortisol, or they might have cortisol that doesn't rise appropriately in response to challenges. As adults, invisible people frequently show dysregulated cortisol patterns, leading to difficulty with energy regulation, sleep disturbance, and a compromised immune system. Chronic stress, perpetuated by the nervous system dysregulation associated with invisibility, accumulates over time in measurable physical ways. Invisible people show higher rates of autoimmune disorders, chronic pain conditions, gastrointestinal issues, and cardiovascular disease. They're more likely to suffer from tension headaches, migraines, and muscle pain. They often develop what's called somatization, the expression of psychological distress through physical symptoms. Their sadness, their anxiety, their deep sense of worthlessness doesn't necessarily emerge as clear emotional symptoms. Instead, it emerges as unexplained physical pain, fatigue, or illness. The interoceptive awareness of invisible people, their ability to sense what's happening inside their bodies, is often significantly impaired. Because their emotional needs were not recognized or validated during childhood, they learned to ignore the signals from their bodies. A child who feels scared but is told there's nothing to be scared of learns to distrust their body's fear signals. A child who expresses hunger and is told to wait learns to suppress appetite signals. Over years, this learned suppression of body signals becomes habitual. As adults, invisible people might not notice they're hungry until they're ravenous. They might not realize they're exhausted until they collapse. They might not feel pain until it becomes severe. This disconnection from their body contributes to neglect of their physical health and to the ability of invisible people to push themselves past reasonable limits. Sleep disturbance is remarkably common in invisible people. Some lie awake with their minds racing, unable to quiet the hypervigilance, even in the safety of bed. Others develop insomnia characterized by difficulty falling asleep due to a kind of underlying anxiety and tension that never fully resolves. Still others sleep excessively, their bodies seeking refuge in sleep from the exhaustion of existing in a nervous system that's chronically dysregulated. The quality of sleep in invisible people is often poor. They might sleep long hours, but wake unrefreshed, the sleep not providing the restoration it should. Invisible people frequently struggle with substance use patterns as a way of managing nervous system dysregulation. Some use alcohol or other depressants to calm an overactivated, hypervigilant nervous system. Others use stimulants to try to push through the freeze response and engage more actively with life. Still others use food, particularly high-sugar and high-fat foods, as a form of self-soothing that can temporarily calm a dysregulated nervous system. These patterns can develop into dependencies or addictions, where the person is simultaneously trying to manage their dysregulation while creating additional problems through substance misuse. Physical self-care is often compromised in invisible people. Because their bodies haven't been valued or attuned to, they don't necessarily prioritize caring for those bodies. They might neglect grooming, exercise, or basic hygiene. Or conversely, they might become obsessive about physical appearance or fitness as a way of trying to finally become visible and valuable. They might engage in restrictive eating patterns or compulsive exercise, attempting to mold their bodies into something worthy of attention. In all these cases, the fundamental disconnection from and devaluation of the body underlies the problematic relationship with physical self-care. Invisible people are also at elevated risk for self-harm and suicidal ideation. While the relationship between invisibility and self-harm is complex and multifactorial, research suggests that the combination of chronic dysregulation, low self-worth, and chronic emotional pain can make self-harm seem like a necessary release or a way of finally feeling something real. Likewise, the question, "Does anyone care if I exist?" that haunts invisible people can progress to suicidal ideation if not adequately addressed. The body, then, becomes not just a repository of the psychological wounds of invisibility, but potentially a site where those wounds can be enacted. Yet the body also holds significant potential for healing. As invisible people begin to reconnect with their bodies through somatic therapy, through gentle movement practices, through learning to attune to physical sensations, they can begin to restore nervous system regulation. The body, which has been shaped by invisibility, can also be the gateway back toward wholeness and visibility. This principle underlies many effective therapeutic approaches for invisible people. Working with the body is working with the roots of the invisible self.